Welcome back to Finding Yahuah, all about enlightenment and spiritual awakening. Enoch is revealing to his son Methuselah the second vision which he had in a dream as a younger man. This vision is a history of the Israelites beginning in the Garden of Eden, told using an elaborate animal allegory in which the individuals and groups of people are represented by different animals. We left off talking about the four white men, which symbolize the archangels who have just subdued the fallen angels. I usually read each verse, but today we will read them as more of a summary rather than word for word so as to retain your interest and understanding, because there are over 100 verses in this chapter and over 50 in the next. But before we begin, let us pray. Yahuah, my Eluah, my Adonai, Heavenly Father and Creator, the Most High. We are gathered together yet again, calling upon your name. We pray for your guidance and wisdom of discernment as we continue to explore these passages contained within the Book of Enoch. Please guide us as we continue our journey of enlightenment and spiritual awakening. Shalom. Then one of those four went to the white cows and taught them a mystery. There was a cow born trembling, and he became a man, and fabricated for himself a large ship. He lived here with 3 other cows in the ship, which covered them. This one of the 4, which went to the white cows, is the archangel Uriel. He was instructed by Yahuah to go to Noah and explain to him the consummation which is about to take place. Teach him how he may escape, and how his seed may remain in all the earth. And that seed is the remnant that Enoch prayed for, as his grandfather instructed him to do after his first vision. This white cow who became a man with a ship is Noah, and the 3 cows living with him are his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Enoch once again looks up to heaven and sees a high roof with 7 waterfalls above a certain village with much water. There were fountains open on the earth in that large village. The water began to boil up and rose over the earth so that the village was not seen. It was covered with water, darkness, and clouds. The height of this water was elevated above the village. Flowing over the village, it stood higher than the earth. Then all the cows which were gathered there were drowned, swallowed up, and destroyed in the water. And as the water drained into the earth, so did their bodies. But the ship floated above it, while all the other cows, along with the elephants, camels, and the asses, were drowned, and they could no longer be found as they perished and sunk into the deep. The elephants, camels, and the asses represent the giants, also known as the Nephilim, which were the product of the fallen angels and human women having children together. Now the waterfalls were removed, and the fountains of the earth became equalized, reaching a state of balance, while other openings formed in the earth, into which the water began to descend until dry ground appeared. The ship remained on the earth as the darkness receded and became light. This is obviously describing the great flood which cleansed the earth from the unnatural birth of the giants, but also of the sinful people represented by the cows, which also perished with the beasts. Then the white cow which became a man, who we know to be Noah, went out of the ship, and those 3 cows went with him. Of the 3 cows, one was white, resembling that cow, referring to Noah, their father, before he became a man. One of them was red as blood, and one of them was black. And the white cow left them. So Noah left his sons once they got off the ship. So here the white cow symbolizes Noah's son Shem, the eldest. The color white signifies righteousness, purity, and divine favor. And Shem's lineage continues as a line of purity from which descends righteous men of Yahuah, such as Abraham, Isaac, and especially Jacob, as well as the entire nation of Israel. The red cow symbolizes Ham, whose descendants are associated with bloodshed and nations and empires that are historically hostile towards Israel. The color red generally symbolizes violence. The black cow is Japheth, whose descendants make up the Gentile nations. Black is used to depict spiritual impurity or the darkness of the Gentile world through their paganistic practices and abominable religious rituals. Then the wild beasts and birds began to come forth, of all different kinds, assembling together lions, tigers, wolves, dogs, wild boars, foxes, and rabbits. The sisset, the avest, which is a type of vulture, kites, and the ravens. And these animals all represent specific races of people, which will be revealed as we continue to read the story. Then the white cow was born in the midst of them. This white cow is Abraham, coming forth from that lineage of the white cow, Shem, while the red and black cows, Ham and Japheth, have intermingled, creating other races outside of the Israelite nation. They began to be at war with one another. Then the white cow, Abraham, brought forth a wild ass, which is his son Ishmael, and also a white cow, which is Isaac, as well as many other wild asses, which just means that he had other children that were not with his wife Sarah. Then Isaac brought forth a black wild sow, his son Esau, and a white sheep, his son Jacob, which are his twin sons. That wild sow, Esau, also brought forth many swine, and becomes the nation of Edom. And that sheep, Jacob, brought forth 12 sheep, sons who are known as the 12 tribes of Israel. When those 12 sheep grew up, they delivered one of them, their brother Joseph, to the asses. And Ishmael was the wild ass, so we know this to be the Ishmaelites, also known as the Midianites. Then those asses, the Midianites, delivered that sheep Joseph to the wolf, which is Egypt. And he grew up in the midst of them, meaning that Joseph grew up in Egypt. Then Yahuah brought the 11 sheep, Joseph's brothers, that they might live with Joseph in the midst of the wolves in the land of Egypt. And the sheep grew in number until they became many. And the wolves became scared of the sheep. They began to oppress them and destroy their young. They left them in torrents of deep water, which is describing the Hebrew-born sons, that all the boys were not allowed to live, and they were drowned upon being born. One sheep which was saved, referring to Moses, escaped and went to the wild asses, the Midianites. Moses prayed to Yahuah with all his might until Yahuah of the sheep descended. He called to Moses. He told him to make the wolves understand that they were no longer to harm the sheep. So Moses went to the wolves of Egypt with the word of Yahuah, and he met another sheep, which describes Aaron, Moses' brother. Both of them together entered the dwelling of the wolves and told them that they were not to harm the sheep. Afterwards, the wolves greatly prevailed over the sheep, and the sheep prayed to their Adonai who came to them, and began to strike the wolves while the sheep were silent. Then the sheep departed from the wolves, and the wolves were blind, and they followed the sheep. But Adonai of the sheep went with them and guided them. All his sheep followed him. His countenance was glorious, and the wolves began to follow the sheep until they overtook them in a certain lake of water, which is the Red Sea. Then that lake, the Red Sea, became divided, standing up on both sides. And while the Adonai was conducting the sheep, he placed himself between them and the wolves. And the wolves followed after the sheep right into the Red Sea. And when they saw Adonai of the sheep, they turned to flee. Then the water of the lake returned and became full and was raised up until it covered the wolves. And Enoch saw that all of them which had followed the sheep perished and drowned. This is a familiar story we all know about when the Israelites were freed from Egyptian slavery through Moses under the guidance of Yahuah. But the sheep passed over this water and entered into a wilderness which was without both water and grass. Then behold, Adonai of the sheep inspected them and gave them water and grass, as Moses was leading and guiding them. This is describing the wilderness journey in which Yahuah always provided what the Israelites needed to survive, even when they were ungrateful and complained. And when he had ascended to the top of a high rock, Adonai of the sheep sent Moses to them. And their Adonai stood before them, but they were all frightened, and they couldn't behold his figure. They trembled. They cried out after Moses and the other sheep, Aaron, saying that they were unable to stand before Adonai and to look upon him. Then their leader Moses went away and ascended to the top of the rock, which is Mount Sinai. But the sheep began to grow blind and to wander from the path, and Moses was unaware of this. Their Adonai, however, was aware and angry with them. And when Moses had learned of this, he descended from the top of the rock, Mount Sinai, and found that there were many which had become blind and had wandered from their path. As soon as they seen Moses, they were fearful, and they trembled in his presence. They desired to return home, back to their path. Then Moses took with him some other sheep and went to those sheep which had wandered astray, and afterwards began to kill them. The other sheep were terrified when they saw this, and it caused those who had wandered off to return back to their path. Enoch saw in the vision that this sheep became a man as well, and built a house for Adonai of the sheep, and made all the sheep stand in that house. And this refers to the tabernacle which was built in honor of Yahuah. Moses, their leader, who became a man, passed away, and all the great sheep perished, while the smaller ones rose up in their place and entered a pasture and approached a river of water, which we know as the Jordan River, because only the younger generation of the Israelites were able to enter the promised land, except for two that we know of, Joshua and Caleb. All the sheep mourned for Moses. Eventually, they ceased to cry after Moses and crossed the Jordan River into the promised land. There arose other sheep, all of whom led them. And this is a reference to the judges that were set over Israel, which can be found in the book of Judges. Then I saw that the sheep entered a godly place, and a territory delectable and glorious, which is the promised land. I saw also that they became satisfied, and that sometimes their eyes were open, and that sometimes they were blind, until another sheep arose, referring to Samuel, and he led them. He brought them all back, and their eyes were open. Then dogs, who represent the Philistines, foxes, who represent the Ammonites and Moabites, and the wild boars, who represent the Edomites, all began to devour them, until again another sheep, Saul, arose, and the Adonai, or king of the flock, as a ram to conduct them. This ram began to butt on every side those dogs, foxes, and wild boars until they perished. So at first, Saul was a successful ruler and defeated the enemy nations. Enoch saw the ram in the midst of them, who had laid aside his glory. And he began to strike the sheep, treading upon them and behaving himself without dignity, because Saul began to lose his mind. Their Adonai sent a sheep, David, and raised him up to be a ram, which symbolizes a king, to guide the sheep instead of Saul, that sheep who laid his glory aside. All the time that the dogs, the Philistines, troubled the sheep. The first ram, Saul, paid respect to the latter ram, David. Then David arose and fled, and the Philistines caused Saul, the first ram, to fall. But David arose and led the smaller sheep. He begat many sheep and died. Then there was a smaller sheep, a ram instead of him, which became a prince and a leader conducting the flock. And this is referring to one of the sons of David, which we know to be Solomon. And the sheep increased in size and multiplied, becoming many once again. And all those dogs, the Philistines, the foxes, who are the Ammonites and Moabites, and the wild boars, the Edomites, feared and fled away from Solomon. Solomon also struck and killed all the wild beasts, so that they could not again prevail in the midst of the sheep. And that house was made large and wide, a lofty tower, built upon it by the sheep for Yahuah of the sheep. Then Yahuah of the sheep stood upon that tower and caused the sheep to approach him. Again, those sheep wandered, going various ways, forsaking that house. And that their Adonai called to some among them, whom he sent to them. And these are the prophets which Yahuah sent to save his people and bring them back to him. But these prophets the sheep began to kill. And when one of the prophets, Elijah, was saved from slaughter, he cried out against those who were desirous of killing him. But Yahuah of the sheep delivered Elijah from their hands, and made him ascend to him and remain with him. As we know Elijah to be the second person to be raptured or taken without tasting death, the only other person raptured as was Enoch. He sent also many other prophets to them to testify. Again, some of them forsook the house of their Adonai and his tower, wandering on all sides, growing blind. Enoch saw that Yahuah of the sheep made a great slaughter among them in their pasture, until they cried out to him in consequence of that slaughter. Then Yahuah departed from the place of his habitation, and left them in the power of the lions, who represent the Babylonians, and the tigers, who represent the Assyrians, the wolves, which are the Egyptians, and the hyenas, who represent the Samaritans, and also in the power of the foxes, the Ammonites and the Moabites, and of every beast. This refers to the time of the Shekinah, which is Hebrew for the glory of Yahuah. This is the moment that his glory left the tabernacle, after those dogs, the Philistines, had taken the Ark of the Covenant. The departing of his glory symbolizes Yahuah turning away from his people because they turned away from him. And the wild beasts began to destroy the sheep. Enoch saw that he forsook the house of his fathers and their tower, giving them all into the power of the lions of Babylon to devour them, and into the power of every beast. Then Enoch began to cry out, imploring Yahuah of the sheep, showing him how the sheep were being devoured by all the beasts of prey. But Yahuah of the sheep looked on in silence, rejoicing that they were devoured, leaving them in the power of every beast for food. He called upon 70 shepherds and resigned them to the sheep that they might overlook them. To the foreign leaders that watched over Israel during their captivity, Yahuah had to let them be captured by the foreign nations before he could bring them back. I'd also like to point out how indifferent Yahuah is being portrayed in regards to the suffering of the sheep. This is giving Gnostic vibes here, in which the God of our Bible is actually a dark being. This just doesn't feel like the Most High being of pure light. It feels dark and vengeful. Yahuah tells the shepherds they are to overlook the sheep and do whatsoever he commands them. And Yahuah delivered the sheep to the shepherds. Then he called to another, saying, understand and watch everything which the shepherds shall do to these sheep, for many more of them shall perish than I have commanded. There will be an account, all of the destruction by each of the shepherds, as a testimony against them, that I may know all of their proceedings, and that I may see what they will do, whether they will act as I have commanded them or not. However, neither shall you make any explanation to them, nor shall you reprove them. Only shall there be an account of all the destruction done by the shepherds. Then, as Yahuah knew they would, the shepherds began to kill and destroy more sheep than he had commanded of them. The one which Yahuah has charged with documenting the actions of these shepherds is Enoch himself, as Enoch had been taken long before these events occurred and became the scribe of Yahuah. Enoch is currently seeing a vision and a dream of the future events that are to take place, as well as his part in these events. Yahuah knew that the leaders he set over his people would become drunk with power and go beyond his instructions. And the shepherds left the sheep in the power of the lions of Babylon, so that many of them were devoured by the lions of Babylon, and also by the tigers of Assyria, and even the wild boars of Edom preyed upon the sheep. That tower was burned, and that house overthrown, which caused Enoch to grieve because he was unable to know whether or not they ever entered that house again. The house represents the city of Jerusalem, which we know they will go back to rebuild. The tower represents the temple built by Solomon. In this specific section, the house has fallen down because the vision is detailing the aftermath of the Babylonian exile, during which Jerusalem and the first temple built by Solomon were completely destroyed. In scripture, there were two groups of Israelites that were eventually captured. The first group was taken by the tigers of Assyria, and later a second group would be taken captive by the lions of Babylon. When this occurs, the city of Jerusalem was left in ruins. The wall was destroyed, along with all that Solomon had built, including the temple and its tower. Enoch kept track and documented that the shepherds delivered the sheep to all the wild beasts that they might devour them. And the shepherds had destroyed more sheep than was ordered, which caused Enoch to weep on account of the sheep. Enoch sees in this vision sheep destroyed by the shepherds every day. He gave each of his sephirim, or books, to Yahuah of the sheep, all which the shepherds had done, and all the sheep which they had delivered up to destruction. Yahuah took the sephir in his hands, read it, sealed it, and deposited it. After this, Enoch saw the shepherds overlooking for 12 hours. These 12 hours define a period in which the Israelites were in captivity. And behold, 3 of the sheep departed, arrived, and went in, and began building all which was fallen down of that house. This verse describes the historical return of the Jewish exiles from Babylon under the decree of Cyrus the Great. These 3 sheep refer to Zerubbabel, Joshua, and Nehemiah, recorded in the biblical books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Haggai. Zerubbabel, the governor of Judah who led the first major wave of returning Jewish exiles, laid the foundation to rebuild the temple. Joshua, the high priest, was a spiritual leader who partnered with Zerubbabel to restore the altar and the practice of religious sacrifices. Nehemiah, a captive Jew, was made the cupbearer to the Persian king. He later went to rebuild the walls and gates of Jerusalem with the third and final group of Jewish exiles. But the wild boars of Edom hindered them and tried to stop the rebuilding of Jerusalem, although they prevailed not. This is a symbolic reference to the Samaritans and neighboring adversaries who opposed the reconstruction of Jerusalem and tried to stop its rebuilding. Again, they began to build as before and raised up that tower, which is the temple. And again they began to place before the tower a table with every impure and unclean kind of bread upon it. This verse is a reflection of the internal spiritual corruption during the Second Temple period, which Malachi and other prophets complained about. Although the people were rebuilding and claiming to come back to Yahuah, they were still caught up in their spiritual uncleanness. And it seems that these sheep can never be quite perfect enough. The sheep were blind and could not see, as were the shepherds. Thus they were delivered up to the shepherds for a great destruction, who trod them under foot and devoured them. Yet was their Adonai silent, until all the sheep in the field were destroyed. The shepherds and the sheep were all mixed together, but they did not save them from the power of the beasts. The sheep that refused to come back to Yahuah were destroyed. In some ways, it's like a plant. When certain leaves are dying or no longer viable, it's best to trim them off so that the plant doesn't waste energy and resources going to a part of the plant that's not going to grow. Then Enoch, who wrote the Sephir, ascended and read it at the residence of Yahuah of the sheep. He petitioned Yahuah for the sheep and prayed, pointing out every act of the shepherds and testifying before Yahuah against them all. Then taking the Sephir, left it with Yahuah and departed. In my Sephir, the footnotes for this final verse say that this was Baruch, which I believe refers to 1st and 2nd Baruch, which are 2 other biblical texts contained within the Sephir, and not found within your standard Christian Bible. Baruch means blessed in Hebrew, and this man was a scribe or a prophet of Yahuah who was also friends and a scribe of the prophet Jeremiah. The two books of Baruch are first, the prophecy of Baruch, which addresses the Jewish people in exile, and messages concerning the eventual restoration of Israel. The second book is the Apocalypse of Baruch, which features deep visions about the end times, the reign of the Messiah, and the ultimate destruction of worldly corruption. Enoch observed 37 shepherds overlooking the sheep to pasture, all of them in their own period. Afterwards, all the birds of heaven arrived, the eagles of Rome, the vultures, who may represent the Arabic people, the kites of Greece, and the ravens of Syria. The eagle instructed them all, as Rome had become a great influential nation, conquering many nations and territories. And all these birds began to devour the sheep, to peck out their eyes and to eat up their bodies. The sheep then cried out as their bodies were devoured by the birds. Enoch says, I also cried out and groaned in my sleep against the shepherds which overlooked the flock, as these foreign rulers in charge of the sheep allowed this and did nothing about it. And I looked while the sheep were eaten up by the dogs of the Philistines, the eagles of Rome, and the kites of Greece. They left them no body, nor skin, nor muscles, until only their bones remained and fell upon the ground. And the sheep became diminished or reduced in number, but also are now reduced only to bones. I observed likewise during the time the 23 shepherds were overlooking who had completed in their respective periods 58 periods. So in verse 1, it mentioned 37 shepherds, and here it mentions 23 shepherds, which is a total of 60 shepherds. Some people claim that verse 1 made a mistake or was mistranslated and should have said 35 shepherds, because apparently there were a total of 58 shepherds and 58 periods. And 35 plus 23 equals the 58 shepherds, which are a reference to those foreign rulers over the Jewish exiles. Then were small lambs born of those white sheep, who began to open their eyes and see. These lambs symbolized the prophets of Yahuah, the last of the prophets sent, as some Israelites were still awaiting deliverance from Babylonian captivity, while others were yet rebuilding Jerusalem. The sheep, however, did not cry out to the lambs, nor did they hear what the lambs uttered to them. The sheep were deaf and blind, with stubborn refusal to turn back to the path of righteousness. These sheep were ignoring the prophets. Enoch continues saying, I saw that the ravens of Syria flew down upon those lambs, the prophets, that they seized one of those lambs and began tearing the sheep in pieces and devouring them. Horns grew upon those lambs, and the ravens of Syria landed upon those horns. Then a large horn sprouted out of an animal among the sheep, and he looked at them. Their eyes were wide open, and he cried out to them. Then the Debela saw him, all of whom ran to him. The Debela is a great ram representing the Messiah, the animal among the sheep from which this large horn sprouted. We are now in the New Testament portion of the Bible, in which Yahushua has come to John the Baptist and will be baptized as they continue to endure persecution for their faith. Horns are often a symbol of power and status, used here as a major biblical metaphor for strength, glory, and salvation for these prophets. This large horn on that animal, the Debela, symbolically represents John the Baptist, sometimes referred to as the last prophet of the Old Covenant, bridging the Old and New Testaments by fulfilling the Old Testament prophecies. All the eagles of Rome, the vultures, the ravens of Syria, and the kites of Greece were still carrying off the sheep, flying down upon them and devouring them. The sheep were silent, but Debela lamented and cried out. Then the ravens of Syria fought with them. They wished to break this large horn, but they could not. Enoch says, I looked at them until the shepherds, these foreign rulers over the Jewish exiles, the sheep, came with the eagles of Rome, the vultures, and the kites of Greece, encouraging the ravens to break the horn of the Debela. But he fought against them and cried out that help might come. Then Enoch perceived that the man came, who had written down the names of the shepherds, and who had ascended up before Yahuah of the sheep. I thought this was Enoch himself, but now I believe this to be Baruch, the scribe of the prophet Jeremiah, who we talked about at the end of the last chapter. He brought assistance, referring to Moses, which caused everyone to see him descending to the help of Debela. I believe this is a referral of when John the Baptist baptized Yahusha and the following transfiguration that occurred. Enoch says, I perceived likewise that Yahuah of the sheep came to them in wrath, while all those who saw him fled. They all fell down in his tabernacle before his face, while the eagles of Rome and the vultures and the ravens of Syria and the kites of Greece gathered together, bringing with them all the sheep of the field. They all came together and tried to break the horn of the Debela. Then I saw that the man who wrote the Sephor at the word of Yahuah opened the Sephor of destruction, which the last 12 shepherds wrought, and pointed out before Yahuah of the sheep that they destroyed more than those who preceded them. So these last 12 shepherds, added with the other 58, equals 70. And with these 12, the Jewish exile is completed, and they are no longer in captivity. Enoch continues to say, I saw also that Yahuah of the sheep came to them, and taking in his hand the scepter of his wrath, seized the earth, which became torn, while all the beasts and birds of heaven fell from the sheep and sunk into the earth, which closed over them. And this is a reference to Armageddon, the end of the world, when the elect will be saved and the sinners shall be removed. Enoch says, I saw too that a large sword was given to the sheep, who went forth against all the beasts of the field. But all the beasts and birds of heaven fled. Historically, this is a reference to the Maccabean revolt. Following the conquest of Alexander the Great, Judea fell under Greek control. They aggressively attempted to assimilate the Jews into Greek culture, which is known as Hellenization. Enoch says, I saw a throne erected in a delectable land, upon which sat Yahuah of the sheep, who received all the sealed Sephirim opened before him. These Sephirim are the books, the records of those shepherds and many others who have greatly sinned. It said the judgment was set, the books were open, and John the Apostle had the same vision. It said, and the books were opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life, and the dead were judged out of those things which were written in the books according to their works. Then Yahuah called the first 7 white ones, his archangels, and commanded them to bring before him the first of the first stars, the first star which fell down first. And this is a reference to Azazel, who is given credit as the first star to fall, leading the rest of the 200 watchers who became the fallen angels with him. And he spoke to the man who wrote in his presence, who was one of the 7 archangels, saying, Take those 70 shepherds, which I delivered up the sheep to. And upon receiving the sheep, they killed more of them than I had commanded. They were all bound and standing before Yahuah. First came the trial of the stars. Being judged and found guilty, they went to the place of punishment, thrust into the deep, full of flaming fire and pillars of fire. Then the 70 shepherds were judged, and being found guilty, were also thrust into the flaming abyss. One abyss was open in the midst of the earth, full of fire. And the blind sheep were brought to this abyss to be judged, and being found guilty, were thrust into the abyss of fire and were burnt. The abyss was on the right of that house, meaning it was to the right of Jerusalem. And I saw the sheep burning and their bones being consumed. That ancient house and everything in it, they brought out and deposited it in the place on the right side of the earth, which is that abyss. Enoch also saw that Yahuah of the sheep produced a new house, great and higher than the first, which he had bound by the former circular spot, which is the original location of the first temple in Jerusalem. It had new pillars and new ivory, and it was more abundant than the first. All the sheep which were left, all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds of heaven fell down and worshipped, obeying everything. And this is a reference to the millennial kingdom. After the day of judgment, following Armageddon, when all those who are left behind become part of the heavenly family, known as the elect or the chosen ones. Then those three, clothed in white, the archangels, who were holding me by my hand, had before caused me to ascend. They raised me up and placed me in the midst of the sheep, before judgment took place. The sheep were all white with wool long and pure, assembled in that new house, while Yahuah of the sheep rejoiced with great joy. They laid down the sword which had been given to the sheep, and returned it to his house, sealing it up in the presence of Yahuah. The final battle is over, and this sword is no longer needed. All the sheep would have been enclosed in that house had it been capable of containing them. And this sounds like some of the sheep had to die, not only because of sin, but possibly because there wasn't enough room for them in the afterlife. But maybe the house was incapable of containing them because of their darkness of sin. And the eyes of all were open, gazing upon the good one. The house was large, wide, and extremely full. A white cow was born whose horns were great, and that all the beasts of the field and all the birds of heaven were alarmed at him. Then I saw the nature of all of them was changed, and that they became white cows. This white cow with horns symbolizes the Messiah, and his horns symbolize the power he possesses, which caused these beasts to pray for forgiveness, and hence they became white cows, transforming in purity, being adopted in righteousness. And this symbolizes the transformation when we receive our new bodies as the elect and chosen ones. And that the first in the midst of them spoke when that word was a wild ox. Upon its head were great and black horns. This is also a symbol of the Messiah and his great power. And we know that Yahusha is the word. Enoch concludes the revelation of his dream visions to his son Methuselah, saying, "While Yahuah of the sheep rejoiced over them and all the cows, I lay down in the midst of them. I awoke and saw the whole." Enoch saw the whole thing. "Afterwards I wept abundantly. My tears would not cease, so that I became incapable of enduring it. Of every individual circumstance respecting the conduct of mankind was seen by me. In that night I remembered my former dreams. Being a chosen one of Yahuah isn't easy, as we have seen Enoch struggle through these many episodes to handle the visions that he's been shown throughout the chapters. And this concludes the Book of Dream Visions. Next time we are moving on to the Epistle of Enoch, which is a letter that Enoch wrote for his descendants, for his future generations, for us. Until next time, Yahuah, my Eluah, my Adonai, my Heavenly Father and Creator, the Most High. We are thankful for the blessing of walking with you today as we explored your word and your truth. Thank you for blessing us with the ability to learn and to understand these passages. Please make me an instrument of your light. Shalom. And to everyone who has made it this far, I thank you so much for your support by merely watching this video.